I suppose, of course, you would impart them to me simply out of pure disinterestedness, without a thought of pecuniary compensation?" Hobson winced and glanced nervously about him. "I must hasten," he said. "I cannot stop for explanations, but you will find me in my office at 2 o'clock to morrow, if you care to call. Meantime, my young friend, I am not perhaps as mercenary as you think, and I may be able to be of great assistance to you." And with a final bow, the man hastily disappeared around a turn of the winding walk. Scott proceeded in the opposite direction in a deep study. "Is it possible," he soliloquized, "that that creature is on my track and has any proposition to make to me? Or is he afraid that I know his secret, and that I may deprive him of his hold upon the Mainwarings? More likely it is the latter. A week ago I was looking for that man, and would probably have endeavored to make terms with him, though it would have involved an immense amount of risk, for a cast iron contract wouldn't hold him, and his testimony would be worth little or nothing, one way or the other." Scott glanced at the address on the card. "Not a very desirable locality. It probably suits him and his business, though, I believe. I will give the scoundrel a call and see what I can draw out of him." Dinner was announced as Scott returned to the house, and a number of circumstances combined to render the meal far pleasanter and more social than any since the death of the master of Fair Oaks. Mr. Merrick was nowhere to be found, and the slight restraint imposed by his presence was removed. Mrs. LaGrange and her son were also absent, preferring to take their meals privately in an adjoining room which Hugh Mainwaring had often used as a breakfast room. The silence and frigidity which had lately reigned at the table seemed to have given place to an almost universal sociability, though Ralph Mainwaring's face still wore a sullen scowl. As Mr. Whitney met the secretary, his sensitive face flushed at the remembrance of their late interview, and he watched the young man with evident curiosity. Scott was conscious, however, of an increased friendliness towards himself on the part of most of the guests, but feeling that it was likely to prove of short duration, he remained noncommittal and indifferent. As they left the table, Miss Carleton rallied him on his appearance. "Mr. Scott, you are a mystery." "Why so, Miss Carleton, if you please?" he asked quickly. "Just now, when everybody's spirits are relaxing after that horrible inquest, you look more serious and glum than I have ever seen you. I threw myself into the breach this afternoon to rescue you from the enemy's grounds, whither you had been carried to the sensational statements of Mrs. LaGrange and the coachman and chambermaid, and I have not even seen you smile once since. Perhaps," she added archly, "you didn't care to be rescued by a woman, but would have preferred to make your own way out." "No," said Scott, smiling very brightly now, "I'll not be so ungrateful as to say that, but I believe I am generally able to fight my own battles. But I will confess that I was somewhat disappointed this afternoon when you gave your testimony." "How could that be?" she inquired, greatly surprised. "Up to that time I had flattered myself that I had one friend who had faith in me, even though circumstances conspired against me. I discovered then that it was no confidence in me, but only a knowledge of some of the facts, that kept her from turning against me like the rest." Scott spoke in serio-comic tones, and Miss Carleton looked keenly in his face to see if he were jesting. "No, you are mistaken, Mr. Scott," she said slowly, after a pause. "My confidence in you would have been just as strong if I had known nothing of the facts." "Thank you, I am very glad to hear that," he answered, then added gently, "Would it be strong enough to stand a far heavier strain than that, if it were necessary?" His tones were serious now, and she regarded him inquiringly for a moment before speaking. Then, seeing young Mainwaring approaching with his sister and Miss Thornton, she replied in low tones, "I have no idea to what you refer, Mr. Scott, and I begin to think you are indeed a mystery, but you can be assured of this much. I would never, under any circumstances, believe you capable of anything false or dishonorable." Scott's eyes expressed his gratification at these words, and he would then have withdrawn, but neither Miss Carleton nor young Mainwaring gave him an opportunity to do so without seeming discourteous. Both drew him into conversation and found him exceedingly entertaining, though reserved concerning himself. Isabel Mainwaring still held herself aloof and took little part in the conversation, but to make amends for this, Miss Thornton bestowed some of her most winning smiles upon the handsome young secretary, her large infantile blue eyes regarding him with wondering curiosity. After a pleasant evening, Scott excused himself and retired to his room, but an hour or two later there was a knock at his door, and on opening it he saw young Mainwaring in smoking cap and jacket. "I say, Scott, won't you come out and have a smoke? I've got some fine cigars, and it's too pretty a night to stay in one's room. Come out on my balcony and we'll have a bit of a talk and smoke." Scott readily consented, and the two young men proceeded to the balcony upon which Mainwaring's room opened, where the latter had already placed two reclining chairs and a small table containing a box of his favorite Havanas. For a few moments they puffed in silence, looking out into the starlit night with its beauty of dim outline and mysterious shadow. Mainwaring was the first to speak. "I say, Scott, I am awfully ashamed of the way that some of us, my family in particular, have treated you within the last day or two. It was confoundedly shabby, and I beg your pardon for my share in it, anyhow." "Don't waste any regrets over that matter," Scott answered indifferently. "I never gave it any thought, and it is not worth mentioning." "I do regret it, though, more than I can tell, and I haven't any excuse for myself. Only things did look so deucedly queer there for a while, don't you know?" "Well," said Scott pleasantly, "we are not out of the woods yet, and there is no telling what developments may arise. Things might look queer again, you know." "That's all right. I know a gentleman when I see him, unless I happen to lose my head, and that doesn't occur very often. Now it's different with the governor. He's got so confoundedly wrought up over that will, don't you know, that he can't think of anything else, and there's no reason in him." "As I understand it," remarked Scott, "Mr. Mainwaring expects to win the property in any case, either for you or for himself." "Yes, and naturally you might think that the loss of the will wouldn't amount to much, one way or the other. But it's like this: the governor and I are very different. I know we've got plenty of ducats, and that's enough for me, but not for him. He is ambitious. It has always galled him that we were not in the direct line of descent from the main branch of the Mainwarings, and it has been his one great ambition since the death of old Ralph Mainwaring, Hugh's father, a few years before I was born, to win into his own family the old Mainwaring estate. He had an idea that Hugh would never marry, and gave me his name, hoping that I would be made his heir. Should the governor succeed in this scheme of his, he will immediately buy back the Mainwaring estate, although he knows I don't care a rap for the whole thing, and we will then have the honor, as he considers it, of perpetuating the old family line. On the other hand, if the property goes to the nearest heirs, it will be divided between him and his younger brother. Uncle Harold has no more ambition than I have, and though he is at present a bachelor, that is no guarantee that he will remain one, and anyhow, it isn't likely that there will be much of his share left when he gets through with it, so you see how much importance the governor attached to that will." "I understand," said Scott, as his companion paused. Then he added, musingly, "Your uncle's name seems to be rather unusual among the Mainwarings. I do not recall your having mentioned it before." "What, Harold? On the contrary, it is the great name in our family, especially in the main line. I would have been given that name if the governor had not been looking out for Hugh Mainwaring's money. There was a direct line of Harolds down to my great-grandfather. He gave that name to his eldest son, but he died, and the next one, Ralph, Hugh's father, took up the line. Guy, my grandfather, was the youngest." "One would almost have thought that Hugh Mainwaring would have borne the name of Harold," commented Scott. Young Mainwaring smoked for a moment in silence, then said in lower tones, "Old Uncle Ralph had a son by that name." "Indeed! Had Hugh Mainwaring a brother?" Scott asked in surprise. "Yes, there was a brother, but he died a great many years ago. There is quite a story connected with his name, but I don't know many of the particulars, for the governor seldom alludes to it. I know, however, that Harold was the elder son, but that Uncle Ralph disinherited him for marrying against his wishes, and afterwards died of grief over the affair, and soon after his father's death Harold was lost at sea." "You say he married. Did he leave any children?" "No, I believe he had no children, but even if he had, they would have been disinherited also. Uncle Ralph was severe. He would not even allow Harold's name to be mentioned, and Hugh also must have turned against his brother, for I have heard that he never spoke of him or allowed any allusion to be made to him." "Well," said Scott after a pause, "I believe Hugh Mainwaring's life was far from happy." "You are right there. I'll never forget the last words he ever spoke to me as I took leave of him that night. They were to the effect that he hoped when I should have reached his age I would be able to look back over a happier past than his had been. It is my opinion, too, that that woman was the cause of his unhappiness, and I believe she is at the bottom of all this trouble." Their conversation had drifted to the mystery then surrounding them, and for more than an hour they dwelt on that subject, advancing many surmises, some strangely improbable, but none of which seemed to bring them any nearer a solution of the problem. "My first visit to this country has proved an eventful one," said young Mainwaring, as at a late hour they finally separated for the night, "and I don't know yet how it may terminate, but there's one thing I shall look back upon with pleasure, and that is my meeting with you, and I hope that from this time on we will be friends, and that this friendship, begun to-night, will be renewed in old England many a time." "Are you not rather rash," Scott inquired slowly, considering how little we know of each other. The circumstances